friends, as we all know that when we try to speak about the Indian sociology, we had to borrow upon many perspectives which have been seen globally, and it also has certain amount of leaning from the European framework. But the point is that how they are to be taken. Are they going to be relevant with regard to the understanding of Indian society, or can we see their application in terms of certain amount of modification? That is going to be an important concern when we try to build upon how we can have these perspectives. Yeah, one thing is sure that since they provide us with the global understanding, or they are widely tested. So, the possibilities of having their failure in the Indian setup appears to be lesser in that sense. So, the Marxian perspective, which of course, is the topic of concern for today's lecture, is going to be a sensitive perspective, because it is considered to be one of the most relevant and reliable perspective for understanding the process of change. So, the Marxian perspective that we are speaking about, and that too with regard to the Indian society, we try to find out that the Marxian perspective has its own limitation also, but here we are more concerned about its utility for understanding and analyzing the Indian society. So, first of all, we will understand the broader meaning of the Marxian perspective. It will be followed by the important contributors who had tried to see the Indian society from the Marxian perspective, and the two names which comes prominently in our mind are Professor D.P. Mukherjee, and another of course, is Professor A.R. Desai. Apart from that, there are many other people who try to see the Marxian perspective, like we try to speak about certain other historians, especially Romila Thapar, and we have Professor R. N. Sharma, and also Irfan Habib. Most of them have followed the Marxian perspective for understanding and analyzing the society in a specific setting, especially when we try to see the contribution of Ramkrishna Mukherjee. He also has contributed significantly towards the understanding of the Indian society, especially the rural society, from the Marxian perspective. So, I think many scholars had tried to work upon the Marxian perspective in a specific framework, but the point is that we are not going to take all of them together, but our focus is restricted to D.P. Mukherjee and A.R. Desai, who try to understand the Marxian Indian society in a specific framework. Now, first of all, we have to understand how or what are the important aspects which are to be dealt when we are trying to see the Marxian perspective. The one important thing that we try to see with regard to the Marxian perspective is that it tries to give more emphasis upon the economic interpretation of the Indian society, or of the society in general, economic interpretation. That is of course, one important aspect that one has to see. Second important aspect with regard to the Marxian perspective is that it believes in contradictions. It believes in contradictions. So, contradiction is an important source for talking about the change, and parallelly we have this issue of the dialectics. So, the dialectics is going to be an important principle for studying and analyzing the process of change. Dialectics, which has to be based on what I can say, the unity of opposites, or we try to see it in terms of the struggle over the resources. It also tries to speak about the change which has to be there in terms of the differentiation as well as in terms of diversification. So, many aspects are there which are going to be important when we try to speak about the Marxian framework. But the important thing is that we have to see that how the Marxian perspective is going to be instrumental in understanding and analyzing the Indian society. And as we know that we also had a leaning of or the criticism of the European theories, especially whether they can be adopted as it is in the Indian society. So, for that also we had certain understanding with regard to indigenization that we have talked in the other lectures, that indigenization also is a plea for understanding or grasping about and acceptance of the Western notions in the localized way. And that is how we try to see the importance of the Marxian perspective, that it can have its utility with regard to having its relevance in the specific setting. Now, talking about Professor D. P. Mukherjee, who was instrumental in talking about the changes in Indian society, and if you try to speak about his work, I think the range was quite varied, and beyond that if you try to see, Professor Dhruvajyoti Prasad Mukherjee was an outstanding Indian who had the versatile interest in terms of in the field of sociology, economics, literature, music, arts and history. So, I think he tries to have even the literature in that sense, as such the fictions where he is trying to speak about the different aspect of the changes, and that too using the Marxian framework. Talking about his academic career, D. P. Mukherjee had his beginning from the Department of Economics and Sociology at University of Lucknow in 1922, and he was seen as one of an important pioneer in the Lucknow school of thought, who had put the Lucknow University to the international level. So, D. P. Mukherjee's contribution has remarkable his recognition as well as the recognition which he has given to the Lucknow University is definitely going to be instrumental in bringing about the sociology at Lucknow and at the global map in that presence, because of his presence. He was also the first president of the Indian Sociological Conference, and he was the vice president of the International Sociological Association ISA, and that is how we can gauge his personality, that a person who has its acceptance not only in India, but also in the International Sociological Association. And one thing is of sure, that he wanted to adopt or he wanted to work out for sociology which could be seen in a particularistic way, trying to see Indian society as a unique culture and how he is going to represent that in the international map. Some of his basic contribution, if you try to see, is the basic concepts in sociology, basic concepts in sociology, that is an important contribution. Then you have personality and the social science, personality and the social science, and also you have the modern Indian culture, modern Indian culture and the problems of Indian youths, problems of Indian youths, and one of his celebrated work is the diversities. So, these are some of his important contribution, and as we know that D. P. Mukherjee was a middle class Bengali Brahmin, and he had the higher education. He belonged to Calcutta, but for the training and for the postgraduate understanding. He has moved out also. He has been appointed as in the Department of Economics at Lucknow Universities in 1924. He had served as the UP Labour Inquiry Committee till 1947. He also was instrumental in bringing about the important revolutionary changes with regard to the policy making as in planning in that sense as such. He has also been appointed as a professor of economics at Aligarh Muslim University. So, we try to see that he has the wider acceptance across the nation, across the academia and also in the administrative setup, and that is how we try to see that how versatile he was in terms of making his presence in a specific sense. D.P. Mukherjee was basically speaking about the social change in the Indian societies, and for that he has adopted the dialectical historical method. The method which of course has its lineage from the Marxian framework. The main focus of his study was the emergence of the new class structure, the emergence of the new class structure, and that is he was basically referring to the middle class, the emergence of the middle class which has emerged because of the impact of the Britishers. So, the British impact for the emergence of the middle class in India, and he also was having a understanding that the structural forces behind the class differentiation led to the growth of the national awakening in India, and in that way we try to see that how we can have the various structural forces which are having the differentiation within the existing class structure is also instrumental in bringing about certain amount of consciousness at the different level. He was an exponent of the synthesis theory of Indian culture, synthesis of Indian culture, especially we try to see the Indian culture on the one hand and the non-positivistic Indian society, non-positivistic. So, we have the synthesis of the Indian culture and the non-positivistic Indian sociology, and how we can see the impact of the West on the Indian society in terms of cultural assimilation. So, we have the phenomenon of cultural assimilation because of the impact of the British rule on the Indian society and how it has brought about the changes in the Indian culture. That is going to be an important issue when we try to speak about the change which he is trying to speak about. His perception of the tradition of Indian society was seen as a symbolic system which has the central core of human action as the driving force. The dialectics of diversity was one important aspect which he is trying to see with regard to the theoretical paradigm, and D.P.'s contribution was a monument of life tradition for the sociology in general. So, virtually we try to find out that he was trying to see the central core of the human action which is going to be bringing about the change in the traditions of the Indian society, how he perceives the Indian tradition in terms of an understanding, in terms of the understanding of the change in the traditions, and the person, the human being, his action is going to be instrumental in that. According to him, tradition of Indian society offers a resilient and adaptive social and the cultural forces which must be kept in the framework while analyzing the sociological analysis. And we try to find out that the economic forces has the capacity to change. I think this is going to be an important issue, that the mode of production and its relationships are going to bring about the changes in the Indian society. He says that the value of Indian tradition lies in the ability to have a conserving force to have a break on the hasty passage of development. Adjustment is the end product of the dialectics. Only alienation from nature, man and work will stop the course of high and strenuous endeavor, which has been talked about by D.P. Mukherjee. But the important thing is that how we can see the role of a personality, and in the D.P.'s thought, the treatment of personality in which the methodology and the theories are rooted are going to be an important issue. D.P.'s main concern, D.P. definitely for D.P. Mukherjee, D.P.'s main concern has been the problem of balancing of the values. Now, we try to see that values which are going to be shifted with regard to the modernization, and D.P.'s appeal was to have the synthesis of its own merit. So, we have to gauge the values in terms of certain amount of synthesis which has to be seen, and he says that D.P. was concerned about the progress which is there in the society, and one finds that how the role of Upanishads, Sanatan, Shivam, Advaitam is there with regard to the harmony, welfare and unity, how they are contributing towards the welfare and the unity, and how they are trying to bring about the changeology. The key feature to the D.P. Mukherjee was that how the nature of modernization emerges as a historical process. So, when we try to speak about the notion of modernization, modernization has to be seen not in terms of the emergent future or the emergent present, but it has to be seen in the historical frame. It has to be reflected from the history rather than trying to see modernization as an outcome of certain things. So, if we have to speak about the nature of modernization, we have to see the historical processes, and because of those historical processes, there is an expansion, elevation and revitalization of the various aspects, and that has led to the modernization in a specific framework. Though we try to see these changes in a very systematic manner, but we try to see that the traditional values and the cultural patterns are not the total departure from the modernization, but they are resulting because of the interplay between the traditional and the modern. So, we try to see that whatsoever changes are there, these changes are not abrupt, or they are not going to be what I can say away from the history, from the past. Rather, we try to see that there is an interplay between the tradition and modernity, which has to be seen in the sort of the dialectics, that traditions and modernity, they are not the two opposite things, rather they are having an interplay, and because of that interplay we try to speak about the changes. And in that way his application of dialectics is being seen with regard to the issues of the tradition and modernity. So, the tradition and modernity are basically seen to have certain amount of an interplay, and this interplay is basically leading to the changes. Sometimes they can be seen as an obstacle to modernization, but they can also lead to the acceptance of modernization at a higher level. Now, we try to see that what it does. It basically gives us the freedom to have the alternatives and to have the evolution of the cultural patterns, which cannot be the synthesis of simply the old and the new. The new values and the institutions must have the soil and the roots from which it has imbibed its character. So, the modernization is not coming from an outside, it is not coming from something from an alien body, rather it has its roots, it has its grounding from the very soil from where it has emerged. So, it is not seen as an alien element, rather it has been seen as an outcome of the interplay between the tradition and modernity within the specific setting. So, the modernity can be defined in relation to and not in the denial of traditions. So, we can say that traditions are responsible for bringing about the modernity. We can't say that there is an end of traditions and then we are having the advent of modernity. So, the modernity, for attainment of modernity, the presence of traditions, the role of traditions is going to be of importance, and that is how we try to see the linkage between the tradition and modernity. So, in that way the DP's interest was quite diverse. It ranges from the music, the fine arts. He was trying to speak about the Indian traditions in relation to the modernity. he was having the stronger appeal towards the Marxist understanding about the dialectical interpretation of the encounter between the Indian traditions and modernity. And what he is trying to speak about is that how the West has influenced the Indian tradition in a specific way. Now, we try to see especially the Indian history and economics, which has to be seen in tune with sociology, and what D. P. Mukherjee observed is that it has a distinctive feature of India was its social system, and within that we try to see that the social aspect along with the history, politics and economics, they are also instrumental in bringing about the changes which are there, and it is leading to certain amount of new form of changes in that sense as such. And even the history which has to be seen is not to be seen in terms of the linear history, rather it has to be seen in terms of the contradictions. And he was highly objecting the history which has been written by many historians, by the Indian scholars, because he says that the history which has been written by them are going to be the linear history. And he said that the history which is linear does not speaks about the contradictions, and as we know that the history has full of contradictions, but the way the historians have depicted the history is not going to be a fruitful history, because the contradictions in that sense are going to be minimum. So, the D. P. Mukherjee in that sense tries to study the traditions, and he was not oriented simply to the past, but he also included the sensitivity towards the changes. So, thus the traditions were not the past, they were the living traditions. For them it is going to be important. The traditions which are having the links with the past are going to be adaptive to the present. So, that is how we try to see the sort of continuity which is there, especially when we try to see the various aspects which have came into figure, especially it is not simply that you have the complete transformation of the structure, rather it has certain amount of adaptability of the past traditions and which are being modernized in a specific fashion, and that is how we try to see the change. And what is more important is that D. P. Mukherjee tries to see basically the economic forces of the changes which has been brought about by the British. He says that when we try to see the understanding of the Indian society through history, we try to find out that many forces of changes have been there. He says that the Indian society had the periodic invasions, especially the Muslims have been there, the Muslim invasions have been there with regard to its influence on the Indian culture. Like in the Indian Islams, we have the Sufis, we have also certain amount of change in the monuments in that sense as such, and apart from that there were many other experiences which has happened, certain amount of conflicts were also involved, but the impact of the Islam on the Indian society was not very diverse. The reason being that D. P. Mukherjee was trying to see that the changes which have been brought about by the so called Islamic traditions are not going to bring about the structural changes. To him, the changes which have been brought about were by the Islamic invasion were only the cultural changes in that sense, but these cultural changes are not going to bring about the structural change, the change in the structural arrangements. So, those changes are going to be accommodative. But when he said that the Britishers, when they came, so they try to have certain amount of impact, especially the economic forces of the change, which has led to the transformation of the Indian social structure. And that is where we try to see the Marxian analogy, that how the structural transformation is happening because of the economic forces of the change which has been brought about by the British. And especially when you try to speak about the emergence of the middle class, he says that the Britishers, they try to implant upon certain modernity within the existing traditions, and it is an outcome of the synthesis of this which has led to the emergence of the typical middle class, which is said that they were half Indian and half British. They were by mind they were the British, but by heart they were the Indians, and that is how the tradition modernity has to be displayed. That the understanding is that it is not a new man, it is not what you can say the new change which has to be seen, rather it has to be seen in terms of an interplay, especially when he was trying to see or talking about the issue of changes in the Indian society. He had spoke about two specific aspects in the historical framework, that is speaking about the new man and the new society, and he tries to see that at the different period of time in the Indian society and culture, we try to find the presence of the new man and the new society, and whenever there were contradictions, whenever there were what you can say the crisis in the Indian societies, you had the emergence of the new man, and it has a specific social order, it has the new form of society, and through that we try to become resilient towards the changes. Like he said that we had various new men which have put the so called crisis of the Indian situations, and they have put them safely to the next stage. We have the new men like Raja Ram Mohan Roy at certain period of time, who try to fight against the evils of the various caste institutions, the marriage practices in that sense as such, and his new order in that sense was based on the principle of rationality. Similarly, if you try to see the changes which have been thought of in terms of the new man was the Rabindranath Tagore, and how he was trying to see what you can say the what can be the new order, where the decentralization is going to be an important aspect, where the villages are to be empowered, they have to be given the autonomy, and that can bring about certain amount of new order. Similarly, when he was talking about the independent India, he said that the new man was Jawaharlal Nehru, and that Jawaharlal Nehru, for him the new society was the planned society. So, in the different stages of the crisis in the Indian society, we try to find out that you had the new man and you have the new society, which were the replica of the changes which have been there, but the important thing is that these crisis situations have been overcome because of the principle of dialectics at the different period of time. So, you have the thesis, you have the antithesis, and then you have the synthesis as a new society in that sense, and that is how we try to see the picturization of the dialectics that was involved. Then he is also speaking about one important principle, that is the notion of charveti, that is moving forward, in a sense that he did not believe in the stability of the Indian society and order, rather he was trying to see the dynamicity of the Indian traditions, and that is how he is trying to see the interplay between the tradition and modernity. Now, if you try to see these things in a better way, one can say that he did not adopt the Marxian understanding as it is, rather he was claiming himself to be the Marxologist, not as a Marxist, Marxologist and not as a Marxist. So, the basic understanding in that sense of course, is that he was trying to adopt the philosophy of Marx in the Indian setup, rather than imitating the Marxian analysis as it is in the Indian society, and that is what is needed when we are going for a plea for indigenization, and D. P. Mukherjee has rightly done that not adopting the Marxian what you can say tools of analysis, because the industrial class structure which have been there in the Europe is not the setting over here in India. So, we can't as it is imitate those things as such, but we can have the ground philosophy of Marx in terms of the changeology, and that we can apply to the Indian society. So, this is how we try to see the contribution of D. P. Mukherjee, and how he has wider canvas talking about the economics in that sense, where he was talking about the question of the machine and the technology, and he was to some extent opposed of the Gandhian understanding that machine should not be there. Rather, he was saying that the machine and technologies, they are a part and parcel of the change, and they have to be adopted in such a way that it may not lead to the process of exploitation. And he was talking about the character of the Indian bourgeois, he was talking about the character of the industrial society, and beyond that he was also trying to speak about the advent of modernity, which has the secular character, like talking about the new form of middle class, which are to be seen in terms of the bureaucrats, the technocrats, the lawyers, the teachers in that sense as such, who are part and parcel of the middle class, and they are basically the promoter of the British training, the British policies in a specific framework. So, virtually we tried to find out that the changes which have been there, although the internal contradictions have been there, but these internal contradictions did not have resulted into much wider changes, but the influence of the British on the Indian society in terms of an external force has led to the structural transformation of the Indian society, and that is how we try to see the contribution of D. P. Mukherjee as a Marxologist, not as a Marxist proper. Now, in the similar framework, we have another important person whom we can see as relevant for analyzing the Indian society, that is the contribution of Professor A. R. Desai. A. R. Desai, as we know, is Akshay Ramalal Desai, and he was basically born in Nadiad in Gujarat, and he has a good understanding about the Indian society in the Marxian framework. He went to the University of Bombay for his graduation and got his law degree and PhD under the supervision of Professor G. S. Ghure, who was basically a practitioner of Indology. Later on, A. R. Desai had made a profession in the Bombay University, and he became the head of the department. So, A. R. Desai is basically seen as the practitioner of the dialectical historical model in the sociological studies, and he was been influenced by the works of Karl Marx, Engels and Trotsky, whom he has observed closely, and he had tried to see the modern Marxist approach for the empirical investigations. And if you try to see, he was basically bit critical about non-utilization of the Marxian method in the Indian society, and he rejects that the interpretation of the traditions related to the religion, rituals and the festivals cannot be understood if we are not, or they cannot give the scientific explanation of the changes, and we have to adopt the Marxian method for analyzing the changes in the Indian society, especially when he is trying to speak about the issue of nationalism ideology in that sense as such, in terms of the social configurations, how the social configuration has led to the emergence of nationalism. That is an important aspect that he is trying to work that he tried to work upon, and there he has used the historical materialism as a principle of understanding the changes. He considers that the emerging contradictions in the Indian process of social transformation is mainly because of the nexus between the capitalist bourgeois and the rural petty bourgeois, and also the role of the state apparatus, and all of them results into the emergence of certain contradictions. And here again the involvement of the economic phenomenon is going to be important as such. And I think these things are reflected in most of the contributions of A. R. Desai. To name a few his significant contribution, I think one pioneer contribution of A. R. Desai is the social background of Indian nationalism. Social background of Indian nationalism. That was one of the pioneering work that came in 1948. Another significant work which of course he tries to work upon is the issue of peasant struggle in India, that was basically in 2 volumes in that sense as such, which came in 1979. Then also we have his significant contribution in terms of India's path of development. India's path of development, that was in 1984. So, these are certain important contributions which he has made. He had also worked upon the slum situation, and he tries to understand upon the different aspect of the Indian society. One of his another edited work, which of course remarks about his contribution, is Rural Sociology in India, and this work was basically seen as one of a pioneering work in the field of rural sociology, and there also he tries to apply the Marxian analysis for interpreting the rural Indian society. Now, when we try to see his contribution in terms of the social background of Indian nationalism, he was trying to speak about the nature of changes which has been brought about in the village structure, in the urban structure, and also how it has led to the emergence of the nationalistic feeling. So, when he tries to speak about the village structure, he was trying to see trace the historicity of the village structure, and what he said that the pre-British period, the villages were like what? They were basically seen as the self-sufficient unit. They were basically seen as the self-sufficient unit, which are basically having the population composed of the peasants, mainly the peasants. The basic population in that sense were the peasants, and the peasant families, they enjoyed the traditional hereditary rights to process and cultivate their own land holding from generation to generation. So, the village communes were going to have an important role, and even the individual ownership of the property was missing, and the village was based on the agriculture carried out with the primitive plough and the bullock power, and the handicraft was also seen as another means of the primitive equipments. The village councils, as I said earlier also, the village communes, they were the de facto owners of the village land, and the village land selling was not permissible without the permission of the village communes. So, in that way we try to find out that the village were basically seen as the self-sufficient units which have their own political structure, economic structure, and they have nothing to do with the outside world. And within the village structure, the role of the village panchayat was going to be of economic and political importance, because they are going to be the directive forces of change or bringing about the certain amount of stability to the existing order. Now, when we try to see the transformation which took place in the Indian society during the British period, here also I think as I said earlier in D. P. Mukherjee's understanding that the Britishers were responsible for bringing about the economic transformation, and Ayer Desai also was the believer of the fact that the British advent has led to the structural transformation in the Indian society, especially the changes which have been brought about with regard to the mode of production has led to the emergence of the new order, and that has resulted into the new structural arrangements. Now, what are the changes, the transformation which took place just after the pre-British period? We try to find out that the new economic reforms have been introduced by the British government, and that has basically led to the complete change in the old economic system. And we try to say find that the old land relations and the artisans had transformed completely. The village communes, which appear to be the sole unit for or the decision making bodies for the transaction, now we had the peasant proprietors. So, the peasant proprietors, they acted as the individual ownership of land, and along with that we also had the advent of the zamindars, which was basically seen as the absentee landlords who were basically having nothing to do with the so called cultivation, but we try to see that the zamindars were acting as an intermediary between the government and the masses. The class of artisans which has disappeared in the modern industry. The new classes were the capitalist, which were typically the capitalist. You have the industrial workers, you have the agricultural laborers, and along with that you have the tenants and the merchants. Now, these are certain new categories of class which has emerged with the process of change with the advent of the Britishers. Similarly, we try to see that the new land revenue system which has came into picture, and this new land revenue system, it has basically led to the commercialization of agriculture. Commercialization of agriculture was because of the new land revenue policy, because what Britishers have done is that they have asked for the revenue in cash and not in kind. So, virtually there was a shift from the kind economy to the cash economy, and we have the advent of the commercialization, and so subsistence economy was replaced by the commercial economy. So, virtually we have seen that how there is a shift in the nature of production, change in the aspect especially from subsistence to the so called commercializations. We try to find out that the new class structure in the rural India, we had the absentee landlords, that is the zamindars, as I discussed, you have the tenants, you have the peasant proprietors, you have the agricultural laborers, you have the money lenders, and also you have the merchant class. And in the urban setting, if you try to see, in the urban society also we try to find out that you have the capitalist industrial working class, you have the petty traders, you have the professional class like doctors, the lawyers, the engineers, and other peoples, in that sense the working class. So, the new composition of the class emerged both in the rural India and the urban India. And apart from these changes in the rural social structure and the urban social structure, another thing which has been worked upon by Britishers was that the British government has introduced the railways, the postal system, they have the centralized uniform law, they have the English education, they have the modern industries, and all these things have led to the qualitative changes in the Indian social order. So, all these policies which the Britishers have implemented, which they have devised, they had brought about the qualitative changes in the Indian social order. And we try to find out that the British government, which has done such exploitative mechanism in India, but unintentionally what they have done, that they have led to the unification of the Indian society. Because the new modes like the transports, communication, the railways, the postal service, the uniform laws, all of them had put the Indian society in terms of the linkage, in terms of the connectivity in that sense as such. So, the people, the communities who have been seen in terms of segregations, now they had certain amount of unifications. The role of the railways and the press is significant in this direction, which has brought the scattered and disintegrated Indians into the mainstream. The implications of the various social movements, the collective representations, the national sentiments, and also the consciousness towards the formation of the unionism, all these things have happened because of the unifications of the Indian with regard to this particular issue. And these freedom movements to some extent is responsible for the awakening of the Indian nationalism. Thus, one can say that the India's nationalism is an output of the materialistic conditions which were built by the British colonialism. So, virtually the ideology, the nationalistic feeling is coming out from the materialistic conditions of existence, and thus Desai applies the Marxist approach to the study of nationalism in India, that too in the British rule. He spells out the historical dialectical materialism and applies it to the study of various types of movement, especially in the rural India, in the urban setup, within the caste and the classes structure, the social mobility, the new education system, and especially the role of the press, which also he highlighted has led to the unifications of the Indian society. And in his contribution, Desai is also referring to the increased consciousness which has emerged with regard to the question for the self awareness, social self awareness about the specific issues. Similarly, if you try to see his another contribution, that is India's path of development, he took upon the traditional communist parties and the Marx scholars who had spoke about the alliance with the progressive bourgeois and the semi-feudalism, and he tries to have the two-stage theory of revolution, which has to be seen as a parliamentary road to the socialism in India. Similarly, if you try to see his peasant struggle in India and especially the agrarian struggle in India after independence, the 2 volumes, Desai has excellently talked about the peasant struggle in India during the colonial rule after independence. And Desai suggests that the newly emerged proprietary class as well as the agrarian poor and the agrarian proletariats, they are fighting for their own share with regard to the development process. So, it has led to certain amount of consciousness among the workers, among the various categories of the people, and how they are coming together to bring about the claim for having the more and more fruits from the process of development. So, we try to find out that when Desai is trying to speak about the theories of modernization in terms of the capitalistic path of development towards a desirable value premise, we find out that the ideological values are being rooted with the capitalistic path, which has a clear lineage towards the Marxian understanding about the process of change, that how capitalism has brought about the changes in the new form of society. And if you try to see in a better way, we try to find out that the class character is going to be an important phenomenon in the analysis of Desai. We have the role of the economic in that sense, economic interpretation of the history, how the ideology is going to be directed by the so called economic forces of change and the economic order, they are going to be an important issues. And Desai has rightly highlighted the various aspects of the Marxist approach which can be applied to the understanding of the Indian society. And he has gone to an extent that he is talking about the relevance of the Marxist approach in the Indian society in one of his important works, and that he has addressed in one of the presidential address of the Indian Sociological Society. Now, one thing which has to be found out or which has to be seen is this changes which he is speaking about. He is basically talking about not the quantitative changes which are been there in the Indian society, rather he is trying to speak about the qualitative changes which are been brought about in the Indian society, especially with regard to the nationalism, the reflections on the economic interpretations, and all of them are seem to be more qualitative in nature rather than quantitative in nature. So, we try to find out that the changes, the new orders which have been spoken about by A.R. Desai, it signifies or it tries to highlight what are the important ways in which we can have the interpretation of the Indian society. Now, I think when we try to speak about the variations which have taken place, especially the structural transformation which has taken place either in the rural India, as we rightly said that Desai's work is trying to see the changing order of the rural India, the changing order of the urban India, the role of the media, the role of the movements, especially he is trying to speak about the trade unionism which has emerged, he is talking about the women movement that has emerged. All these things are basically the reflections of the changes which are coming from the economic processes of change, and all these things are basically seen as the changes which are owing to the economic transformations, economic processes of change, and ultimately we try to see that these qualitative changes are responsible for bringing about the change in the Indian social order. Now, here one important point that one has to really see, especially I think as I said that there are many other people who try to speak about the Marxian understanding for analyzing the Indian society. Like there are different principles of Marx which has been used in one way or the other, especially we try to see the contribution of the various scholars in the field of rural India, like we have Ramakrishna Mukherjee, who is trying to speak about the dynamics of change with regard to the rural social structure, trying to speak about the class 1, class 2 and class 3 categories, and which are again on the economic lines. Similarly, the people like Utsa Patnaik trying to speak about the understanding of the class in terms of the exploitation, or we have people like Rudra Datra, who is trying to speak about the other aspect of change, other aspect of the class structure, which are been visible through the typical economic framework. So, most of the people in that sense, whosoever in whatsoever way they have used the Marxian perspective, they to try to rely more upon the class analysis. They are trying to focus upon the mode of production and the means of production as the source of change, and how that has been reflected in the qualitative change in the existing structure. But here we have to see that which D. P. Mukherjee had done to a greater extent, that can we have the understanding of the society based on what I can say, having our own taste, that the typicality of the Indian culture or the Indian society, how much we can see to that aspect also. And there I think we try to find out that definitely we can have the understanding of the class at the global model, but can we think about our own way of looking to the class, that of course has to be beyond the Marxian understanding, and that somewhere we have to see. But the most important thing that we have to carry forward is the Marxian analysis basically is not what I can say is full of contradictions. It is not full talking about the change as such. Rather, we try to see that how they are going to bring about the question of the changes which are qualitative in nature, because the dialectics, as we know, that it is speaking about the changes which are from quantitative to qualitative in that sense as well. So, most of the works which I just shared, I think they are to some extent speaking about the qualitative transformation in the rural or in the urban India in terms of analysis of the caste, and we have to see that how much is the relevance of Marx with regard to the Indian society, especially when A. R. Desai was speaking about the relevance of the Marx in the Indian setup. He was trying to argue that the issues of religion, caste, ideologies, I think they are not going to be a sufficient answer for analyzing the Indian society, and there he is trying to focus upon that why we have to have an understanding of Indian society from the Marxian perspective. Similarly, with regard to the so called industrial class of the Indian society, I think there also he is trying to focus upon that we have to have the understanding of the Indian industrial class in terms of the Marxian framework. Although we may not be having that sharp professionalization, the unionism in that sense is not going to be very sharp, but definitely it has its own bearing for understanding and analyzing the Indian society. And here we try to find out that whatsoever contribution has been made by people like Desai and D. P. Mukherjee, we try to find out that their contribution definitely is going to be crucial for understanding the Indian society in the Marxian framework. And we here try to focus upon the fact that whenever, wherever we are trying to rely upon the Marxian model, I think it is going to bring about not only the qualitative aspect of change, but it is also trying to see the society in a more objective way. In a sense that the ideologies are not going to be the prime factor for analyzing an interpretation of the change. Rather, we are relying more on the qualitative aspect of change, especially we try to see the sort of economic determinism, which is going to be an important feature for understanding the Marxian analysis. So, in that sense, we try to see that the dominant sociological approaches in India are basically following the non-Marxist model, but the Marxist approach has not to be rejected. It has to be seen in the light of bringing about the conformation to the Indian realities, so that we should not be value loaded and we should not be having certain amount of specific ideology to locate and understand the Indian society. The Marxist approach help us to understand the social reality through the means of production, through the techno-economic division of labor involved in operating in the instrument of production, the social relations of productions, and more precisely towards the property relations. I think if these things are there, trying to speak about the property relations, the social relations, we are trying to speak about the instrument of productions and the use of techno-economic divisions in the Indian societies, I think they are going to be quite detrimental for influencing and affecting the Indian society. The state and society in India, which Desai is trying to pinpoint, it provides a critique towards the modernization accepted by the academic establishment. He clearly stated that the modernization on capitalistic path is a desirable value premise, and we have to have the valuable ideological vehicles to the ruling class pursuing towards the capitalistic path. And in one way or the other, the class character, the class roles and the economic ideological functions of the post-independent India state has to be seen by the Marxist scholar in the true sense. And what we have to see is the theme of the repressive role of the state, which is going to be growing resistance to the capitalistic path of development, and that has to be challenged. So, I think the Marxian understanding is not simply restricted to the understanding of the Indian society in a very narrow framework. I think we have to see it in terms of the practitioners also. By practitioners, we mean to say that if we are trying to apply these standard principles, which are more of universal level, then we can have the scientific understanding about the Indian society, and which can also be seen as more what I can say accepted in the global framework, especially when we try to see the question of agrarian struggle, or we are trying to see the urban struggles, urban resistance which are there with the trade unionism. If we had certain amount of professionalization within them, then only we can have the better understanding about the Indian society. So, in that way, what I feel that Marxian perspective can be not a solution, but definitely a suggestive way for locating and looking to the Indian social realities. And in that way, the Marxian method, either it is a question of the economic interpretation or the dialectical approach, which has been used by D. P. Mukherjee in his contribution of tradition and modernity in terms of an interplay, is going to be very crucial. Because if we are missing the past and seeing the present and the future alone, I think that may not be the right way to see the changes. We have to see the changes keeping in mind the past, because Marx himself was saying that the roots of the present and the future are seeded in the past itself. So, the present is going to be responsible for bringing about the changes in the future. So, we can't ignore the past, we can't ignore the historical development of the society. We have to rely on the futuristic trends based on what was there in the past and the present scenario, because they are going to be the immediate factor which will bring about the transformation in the new setup in the coming future. So, with these kind words and the sharing which he had kindly try to go through further readings in that sense as such from Desai and D.P. Mukherjee and many other scholars which I named, so that you can have a better understanding about the Marxian perspective in the understanding of the Indian social reality. So, thank you for listening and having the wider understanding about the Marxian perspective, and for further deliberations we can have some other dialogues maybe in coming future. Thank you.